It always began the same way, with a sound, a low, heavy growl rolling across the French fields, vibrating through the mud. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't wind, it was steel, the kind of sound that made men freeze and look at each other without saying a word. Someone would whisper, "Tiger." The name was enough. To the Germans, it meant power, invincibility, and pride. To the Americans and the British, it meant something else, inevitability. You could hear it before you saw it, and once you saw it, it was usually too late. The Tiger tank didn't creep or hide. It announced itself, dared you to look. Its tracks crushed trees into the soil, and its cannon, that long deliberate barrel, didn't chatter. It spoke once, and that was usually the end of something or someone. By 1943, every Allied tanker knew the truth. Courage alone couldn't stop German engineering. The Sherman tank was brave, it was fast, and there were thousands of them. But against a Tiger, it was like paper against iron. You could hit one all day and watch the shells bounce like stones off a river. Crews joked that the Sherman lit up like a Ronson lighter. Lights every time, they said, because jokes were cheaper than fear. They weren't laughing, not really. Every man who climbed into a Sherman knew the odds. The war had become a cruel equation. For every Tiger destroyed, the Allies lost 5, maybe 10 tanks. The generals said it didn't matter, the factories would make more. But for the men inside them, that wasn't strategy. It was suicide with a schedule. Somewhere behind the lines, men started asking a question that felt like treason. What if bravery wasn't enough? The answer didn't come from a general or a hero. It came from a hangar, half broken and full of noise. British engineers, tired of excuses, stared at an American M4 Sherman parked next to a British 17-pounder anti-tank gun. They weren't supposed to fit together. The gun was too long, the turret too small. But necessity doesn't ask permission. So they cut. They welded. They stripped out the radio, moved the recoil system, and even turned the gun sideways just to make it fit. It looked ridiculous, like a weapon wearing the wrong uniform. But when they fired it, the hangar shook and the test plate on the far wall shattered in half. One shot, clean through armour thicker than any Tiger carried. Someone laughed. Not out of humour, but disbelief. They'd done it. They called it the Firefly. The generals didn't like it. They said it was awkward, unsafe, untested. The barrel was too long, the turret unbalanced, the flash gave away the position. Unusable, one report said. Impractical. But on the front line, men didn't read reports. They read the faces of their friends burning in wrecks. They wanted something, anything that could bite back. By the time the first Fireflies rolled off the line, the invasion of Europe was already underway. Normandy was chaos, smoke, sand, and confusion. Fireflies came ashore in pieces, turrets packed separately, crews assembling them under fire. They weren't supposed to work, but they did. The Germans had grown used to the rhythm of battle, the roar of the Tigers, the cries of the Shermans, the silence that followed. But the rhythm was about to change. At Villers-Bocage, a German column advanced through the hedgerows, Tigers leading, infantry following. They weren't worried. They never were. A few Shermans had been spotted nearby. Harmless, easy targets, hidden in the trees, a Firefly crew waited. The gunner whispered the range. The commander nodded once. The first shot came like a thunderclap. The Tiger on point stopped moving. Flames erupted from its engine deck. The crew never even saw where it came from. Before they could react, another Tiger exploded, then another. 3 kills, 1 minute, 1 Firefly. The laughter stopped. The Germans had been confident, almost arrogant. They thought they understood Allied armour, its limits, its weaknesses. But they had never seen this before. The Firefly could kill from a distance where the Sherman couldn't even scratch paint. Word spread quickly. The enemy learned to fear the silhouette with the long barrel. German crews started painting their own gun tips white to make them harder to spot. Others refused to advance if there were Fireflies reported nearby. One captured officer said later, "We ruled the fields for years. Then one day, we didn't." The tankers noticed the change too. For the first time in years, they could look through the gun sight and not feel like prey. They knew the Firefly wasn't perfect. It was still thin-skinned, still vulnerable, but it gave them something no armour could, belief. Men began naming them like old friends. Hope, Justice, Lucky, the Widowmaker. The smell of oil and sweat mixed with something new. Confidence. By July, the Firefly had proven itself. Allied commanders quietly began assigning at least one to every Sherman troop. They didn't advertise it. They just watched the statistics. Tank losses started to shift. The Germans were still deadly, but they were no longer untouchable. For every tiger that burned, a myth died with it. In the hedgerows of France, the Firefly became a legend whispered between units. You didn't always see it, but when you did, you felt safer. You knew you might have a chance. One American gunner later said, "The Firefly didn't make us heroes, it just let us live long enough to become one." The German commanders began to change tactics. Tigers moved in pairs now, hiding behind terrain instead of leading the assault. The sound that once made men freeze was now a warning for both sides. The battlefield had turned. But the Firefly wasn't a miracle. It was a stopgap, a desperate experiment that happened to work. For every tiger destroyed, 2 or 3 Fireflies might still fall. The 17-pounder could kill, but it couldn't protect. The armour was still thin, the turret cramped, and the recoil violent. Gunners came home with bruises that ran down their arms and shoulders. Loaders lost hearing, commanders lost friends. The tank could destroy a tiger, but it couldn't save everyone. Still, that didn't matter. Because something else had shifted. Morale. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, they could face the enemy on equal ground. In one letter home, a British officer wrote, "The men call it a monster. They say it's ugly. I tell them beauty's never saved a man's life." He was right. From Normandy to the lowlands of Holland, the Firefly became a constant presence. It wasn't mass-produced. It was handcrafted, each one slightly different from the last. The welds weren't perfect, the barrels sometimes bent a fraction out of line, but they worked. And in war, working was enough. When the German tank divisions began to retreat, it wasn't the Firefly alone that forced them back, it was what it represented. The idea that the Allies could learn, adapt, evolve, that their machines could match the fear they'd once inspired. The Germans had built the Tiger to dominate the battlefield through fear. The Firefly turned that fear around. And as 1944 dragged into winter, the men who had once hidden in their Shermans began to look for tigers instead. The hunted had learned to hunt. At night, when the engines cooled and the fields went quiet, some crews would climb onto their tanks and stare at the barrel stretching out into the darkness. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. They knew that inside that metal was a kind of redemption. The Germans had laughed at their tanks, but no one was laughing now. By autumn of 1944, Europe had changed colour. The green fields of France had turned to mud, and every road was lined with the carcasses of machines. Burned-out Shermans and blackened Tigers stood like gravestones to the idea of invincibility. The war that began with confidence had become one of exhaustion. Crews no longer counted days or victories, they counted starts. If the engine turned over in the morning, that was a good day. If you came back with the same number of men you left with, it was a miracle. The Firefly had become a ghost on the battlefield. It didn't move with speed, it moved with patience. The men who drove it had learned something that couldn't be taught in training camps. They learned to wait. In the hedgerows, waiting meant survival. They would sit in silence for hours, the engine off, the tank blending into the foliage. The loader would chew on a cigarette without lighting it. The gunner would keep one eye pressed to the sight, muscles locked, heartbeat slow. Sometimes they never fired at all, sometimes they waited, and nothing came. And other times they would hear it. The grinding steel, the whisper of treads, the faint cough of a diesel engine. Then they knew. Somewhere out there, another predator was hunting too. The Germans had grown careful. They no longer rolled their Tigers into the open. They crept, always expecting a long barrel to be aimed their way. The sound of a single Firefly shot could send entire columns scattering into cover. That was power, not the kind written in numbers, but the kind that crawls into the back of an enemy's mind and stays there. But even power has a price. The Firefly's gun was its strength and its curse. When it fired, the muzzle flash was a beacon visible for miles. Gunners would hold their breath after each shot, counting seconds, waiting for the inevitable return fire. Sometimes they survived. Sometimes the enemy guessed right. The loader's job was a race against fate. The 17-pounder shell weighed nearly 40 pounds, and the space inside the turret was suffocating. Sweat dripped onto ammunition. Men's backs cracked under the strain. The smell of cordite filled their lungs. Every time the gun roared, the whole tank convulsed. The recoil slammed through their bodies, rattling bolts, shaking teeth loose, and still they fired. A British gunner once said, "When you pulled the trigger, it wasn't the enemy you feared. It was your own machine." There was a strange intimacy to tank combat. The men never saw the faces of those they killed. Just a flash, a silhouette, and then a fireball rising into the air. They didn't cheer. There was no satisfaction, only the brief silence that followed destruction, a silence heavy enough to feel holy. By winter, the Firefly had carved its reputation into the soil of Europe. German propaganda denied its existence, calling it an exaggeration of Allied morale. But on the front lines, the soldiers knew better. The myth of the invincible tiger was dying. At Arnhem, a Firefly knocked out a panther that had stalled an entire column. The shot was made at nearly 1,000 yards. When the shell hit, the panther's turret blew clean off and landed in a ditch 50 feet away. The crew inside never had time to scream. Witnesses said the Firefly didn't even move afterward. It just sat there, smoke drifting from the barrel like breath from a sleeping giant. For the men who fought beside it, that was enough. The Firefly didn't need glory. It was built to even the scales. As Allied forces pushed deeper into the continent, the Firefly became a quiet companion to every major advance. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, in the open fields of Belgium, in the ruins of German towns, the long barrel was always there, watching, waiting, ready. But the tank's greatest battle was still to come. In December 1944, the snow began to fall over the Ardennes. The cold came first, then the confusion. The Germans were on the move again, thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, a desperate push through the fog and ice. It was the last gamble, the last breath of a dying empire. The Battle of the Bulge. The Allies were caught off guard. Communications collapsed, roads froze, fuel ran out. Sherman crews huddled in foxholes, too cold to move, too terrified to light fires. When the Tigers came again, they came like ghosts out of the snow. Their whitewashed armour made them almost invisible. The first warning was always the same, the sound of metal, slow and certain, followed by the distant echo of explosions. The Fireflies were scattered, few and far between, but those that were there became the line between retreat and collapse. In Bastogne, one crew took position at the edge of a frozen road, their camouflage a layer of frost and desperation. For hours they listened to the static on the radio. Then they saw it. A column of German armour winding down the hill. The commander whispered to hold, "Wait, wait." The gunner's finger trembled on the trigger. His breath fogged the scope. The range closed to 600 yards. "Fire!" The shot split the silence in two. The lead Tiger erupted, black smoke curling into the white sky. Another shell followed, then another. The recoil rocked the Firefly backward, nearly stalling the engine. The second Tiger fired back. The round missed by inches, the shockwave slamming into the Firefly's side. The loader cursed, blood running from his nose. They fired again. When the smoke cleared, only one tank was still moving. It wasn't German. They didn't celebrate. They sat there in the cold, breathing steam, watching the fire consume what had almost killed them. Later, when the battle reports were written, the Firefly's contribution was barely mentioned. Just a line among thousands, but for those men, that night would never leave them. As winter broke and the Allies pushed into Germany, the Firefly's legend became fact. Crews painted names on the barrels. Revenge, no mercy. God's wrath. They laughed again, but this time it was different. It wasn't bravado, it was relief. The kind that comes when fear finally loosens its grip after years of holding your throat. When they crossed the Rhine, the roads were littered with wreckage. Half-buried Tigers, broken Panzer IVs, twisted Shermans. Machines that had once decided life and death now lay still, stripped of meaning. The Firefly rolled past them all, its tracks clanking through the ruins of the war it had helped end. Some crews stopped to look, others didn't. They just kept driving east, toward the noise, toward whatever was left to fight. War doesn't give you time to appreciate what saves you, it just moves on. But when the Germans finally surrendered, when the guns fell silent and the air smelled of smoke and spring rain, some of the tankers climbed down and looked back at the machines that had carried them. The Shermans looked tired. The Fireflies looked older still, their long barrels blackened and worn. But to those men, they weren't machines anymore. They were companions, survivors. One commander wrote home, "It wasn't the prettiest thing we built. It wasn't the strongest. But it was ours, and it worked." The war ended the way it began, with noise, engines shutting down, weapons being dropped, orders shouted into empty space. The Firefly had done its job. quietly, brutally, perfectly. When the shooting finally stopped, Europe sounded wrong. The thunder of engines, the shriek of shells, the endless grinding of steel on stone, gone. What remained was wind, and the echo of things men could not forget. In the weeks after Germany's surrender, the tank parks filled up again. Hundreds of Shermans and Fireflies stood side by side in long, silent rows. Paint blistered, armour scarred, names still scrawled across turrets in chalk. Mechanics walked among them like priests in a graveyard, touching the hulls, counting the ghosts that lived inside each machine. The Firefly had survived the war, but survival was not the same as belonging. To the generals, it was already obsolete. The war had ended before the next one could begin, and the factories were ready to build something new. But for the men who had fought in them, letting go was harder. They remembered what it had felt like to climb into that narrow space and close the hatch. The air would grow hot and stale. The world would shrink until it was nothing but dials, switches, and the faces of 3 other men who shared your heartbeat. You learned their breaths, their curses, the way each of them gripped the steel when the shell hit. You learned that courage wasn't loud. It was the sound of someone saying, "Ready," even when they weren't. When those crews went home, they didn't talk about glory. They talked about noise, about smell, about weight. The smell of burned oil, the weight of a shell, the sound of the gun when it fired in a closed space. They would close their eyes and hear it again. That brief second of silence before the recoil, the way the floor shook like an earthquake in a box. Some of them missed it. Most did not. The engineers who had built the Firefly went back to quiet offices. They hung up their blueprints and tried to forget how many lives their measurements had saved, or ended. One of them was interviewed years later. He said, "We weren't thinking about killing. We were thinking about balance. They had the tiger. We needed something that could look it in the eye. Balance. That word stayed. Because that was what the Firefly had given back to the war. Balance. Not dominance, not perfection, just the knowledge that the field was no longer one-sided. That courage finally had a weapon worthy of it. In museums now, the Firefly sits under cold lights. The metal looks cleaner, the paint brighter. Children climb the tracks, soldiers take photographs. No one smells the fear that once lived inside. No one hears the heartbeat under the engine. The guides talk about muzzle velocity, armour thickness, design flaws. They forget that each number once had a pulse. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the difference between the 2 wars of the Firefly, the one fought with steel and the one that stayed behind in the men who drove it. In one recorded interview, an American tanker is asked what it felt like the first time he faced a tiger and won. He doesn't answer right away. You can hear him breathing, a rasp like sandpaper. Then he says, "It didn't feel like winning. It felt like finally getting even." He pauses. That's all any of us wanted. The Firefly never became famous the way the Mustang or the B-17 did. There were no parades for it, no Hollywood stories. It wasn't elegant enough. It was awkward, improvisers, born from necessity rather than design. But sometimes history remembers the wrong things, because while the headlines celebrated liberation and victory, somewhere in a forgotten field sat a tank crew who knew exactly what it had taken to make those words possible. They had waited in hedgerows with their engines off, breathing through cloth to hide their breath. They had watched friends burn and kept firing. They had seen the myth of German armour break apart in front of them, piece by piece, through a gun sight fogged with smoke. And when the war ended, they simply parked their tanks and walked away. No speeches, no medals, just silence. One of them left a note scratched into the inside of a turret wall. It said, "She was ugly, but she looked after us." Decades later, when that tank was restored, the words were still there, hidden under layers of paint. The restorers didn't remove them. They couldn't. Some truths belong to the metal itself. Every generation that comes after them will look at the Firefly and see a machine. But for the men who lived with it, it was something closer to a heartbeat made of steel. Because the Firefly wasn't just a weapon. It was an answer. To laughter, to arrogance, to fear. The Germans had believed they ruled the battlefield. They thought their machines could shape the war the way an artist shapes clay. But wars have a way of teaching humility. Somewhere in the night, a gunner looked through his sight and saw the impossible, the tiger burning. And in that moment the balance returned. In the spring of 1945, Europe was a skeleton of itself. Roads once made for carts were ground into ribbons of mud and iron. The smoke of 1,000 towns hung in the air, drifting like memory. Every soldier who had lived to see this far carried the same look in his eyes, a kind of disbelief that the world was still standing. The Fireflies kept moving east, one after another, engines coughing through the ruins of places that had no names anymore. There was no front line now, just movement, columns of armour sliding through the wreckage of a defeated empire. The Tigers were still out there, a few of them limping on empty roads, their crews desperate enough to fight even when the war was already lost. The Firefly crews didn't celebrate their victories. They had seen too much to cheer. Every burning tiger was another crew of men just like them, trapped in the same furnace. Enemy, yes, but human all the same. Sometimes after a battle, they would find a tiger still smouldering, the air shimmering with heat. The commander would order the men to stay back, but someone always looked inside. Always. The smell was unforgettable. Burned fuel, scorched leather, something worse underneath. One gunner said it once and never said it again. That's the smell of winning. They all hated that line. When the German army finally cracked, the Firefly crews followed the retreat through the forests and valleys of the homeland. The cities looked like broken teeth. Civilians watched them pass in silence. No hatred left, just exhaustion. A few children waved. The tankers waved back, out of habit, not joy. Somewhere outside of Cologne, a Firefly ran out of fuel and stopped beside a river. The crew climbed out and sat on the bank listening to the water. It was the first sound in years that didn't mean danger. For a long time no one spoke. Then the loader said, "It's over, isn't it?" The commander nodded. That was all. When the ceasefire was announced, there was no parade for them, no crowd waiting. They just shut down the engines and sat in the quiet. The gun barrels still pointed east, black with soot. Flies buzzed in the heat. Someone began cleaning the sights out of reflex, even though there was nothing left to aim at. Later, orders came to move the tanks into collection points. Park them, drain them, walk away. Men who had spent years sleeping on steel were told to leave it behind and go home. The idea of home felt distant, almost unreal. They had been inside these machines longer than they had been in their own houses. When they climbed down for the last time, some touched the armour as if saying goodbye to a friend. Others didn't look back. One sergeant left his gloves on the turret. "Let her keep them," he said. The war crimes trials began and the headlines filled with names and verdicts. But for the tank crews, the world had already become quiet again. They read the papers without emotion. They had fought their own trial in mud and smoke, and they had lived through it. That was enough. Back in England, the Fireflies were lined up in storage yards, rows upon rows under grey skies. Rain pooled in the barrels, birds nested inside the turrets. Mechanics came with cutting torches and began stripping parts for scrap. The long guns that had once terrified Germany were cut down to silence. Sparks fell where shells had once fired. A few of the tanks were spared, sent to training schools or given to allies. Most weren't. The Firefly had done its job, and the world had already moved on to jet engines and atomic shadows. The age of steel beasts grinding across Europe was ending. For the men who had lived inside them, that ending was harder to accept. Some re-enlisted, some drank, some couldn't sleep unless they heard an engine. One veteran said he kept a wrench on his nightstand because the sound of it against metal helped him dream. Decades later, historians would try to explain why the Firefly mattered. They'd write about velocity, range, armour penetration, the mathematics of survival. They'd compare blueprints and count rivets, and they'd miss the only part that mattered: the feeling, the knowledge that after years of being hunted, the hunted had learned to fight back. Every man who'd ever fought in one remembered that first kill. Not with pride, but with relief, and the kind that empties you out instead of filling you. You never forgot the sight of a tiger burning at the end of a gun sight. You didn't celebrate it. You just watched until the flames went out and the world went quiet again. That quiet became the rhythm of post-war life. Streets filled with light again. Factories built cars instead of weapons, and people tried to pretend that history could be erased with enough noise. But the men who'd lived through it carried silence with them like a scar. They didn't talk about courage or fear. They talked about luck. They said things like, "I was lucky my shell hit first," or "lucky the mud caught the shrapnel." Luck became the language of survival. Years later, when they gathered for reunions, they'd stand in small circles, grey uniforms blending with grey hair. They'd look at photographs of themselves at 20 and smile without really smiling. Someone would mention a name that no one had spoken in decades, and the circle would go quiet again. Then someone would clear his throat and ask about the old tanks, the Fireflies, whether any were still around. And for a moment everyone would look off into the distance, hearing engines that weren't there. The war had made them old long before time did. But when they talked about the Firefly, there was something softer in their voices. They said it was ugly, awkward, a nightmare to load, but it had given them a chance to live. That was enough. One veteran was asked what he thought when people called the Sherman weak or the Firefly just a stopgap. He shrugged. They can call it whatever they want, he said. It brought us home. Sometimes when you walk through a museum, you find one of them. The paint looks too bright, the metal too clean. Children climb the tracks and pose for pictures. They call it a Sherman, because the sign says so. Few notice the difference. The longer barrel, the British gun, the ghost of a name barely visible under fresh paint. Firefly. If you stand close enough, you can still smell the oil, not the sterile kind that lives in engines, but the heavy burned scent that never truly leaves steel. It carries stories. It remembers. Metal always does. An old man once visited one of those museums. He moved slowly, hand on a cane, eyes searching the exhibits until he stopped in front of a Firefly. For a long time he didn't speak. The guide began to explain its specifications, the 17-pounder, the range, the armour. The old man smiled and shook his head. You can read the numbers, he said, but you'll never hear how loud it was inside. He placed his hand on the hull, right where the radio used to be. It was hot, he whispered. Hot enough to burn through your uniform, but we never cared. We just wanted to live long enough to see daylight again. When he walked away, a smudge of grease from his palm stayed on the paint. The attendants wiped it off later, not realizing they had erased the last trace of someone who once sat in that machine when it mattered. The Firefly became a footnote in textbooks. It didn't have the romance of the Spitfire or the heroics of the D-Day beaches. It was a tool, ugly, efficient, forgotten. But sometimes when historians talk about the turning points, they mention it quietly. They say that for a moment the balance shifted, that one piece of improvised engineering gave courage a chance to breathe. There are no films of the first kill at Villers-Bocage, no recordings of the men inside that tank, just a few blurred photographs and the echo of their voices in letters home. One of those letters survived. It reads, "We fired once, the whole world stopped. When the smoke cleared, the tiger was gone. We didn't cheer. We just sat there and watched the barrel smoke. It felt like the war had blinked." You can almost hear him when you read it. The exhaustion, the disbelief, the quiet. The words of a man who had been forced to fight monsters and had lived to see one fall. After the war, the men of those crews scattered back into ordinary life. Some drove buses, some fixed tractors, one taught history at a small school in Iowa. They rarely talked about what they'd done. When their students asked if they'd ever been scared, he would nod once and say, every day. Then he'd change the subject. He died in 1987. The school kept his desk for years. In the drawer, they found a small photograph, a tank half buried in mud, crew standing beside it, grinning. On the back, in fading pencil, "She worked." That was the legacy. Not victory parades or medals, just the quiet proof that they had built something that worked when it needed to. Time moves on, but the fields where those tanks once stood are still there. In the summer, wildflowers grow through the soil that hides their rusting bones. Farmers plough around the places where the earth feels hard, where steel still sleeps beneath. Rain falls, grass grows, and the world forgets, but the ground remembers. It always does. Every so often someone digs up a shell casing, or a gear, or a piece of track. They hold it up to the light and wonder what story it belonged to. They don't know that the story isn't about metal or battles. It's about fear turned into resolve, about men who learned that courage is quieter than legends make it sound. If you listen to old recordings from the war, you can sometimes hear a Firefly firing in the background. It's only a second long, a crack, a roar, and then silence. That silence says more than any word could. Because after the roar, someone lived. The Germans had laughed at their tanks once. They had called them toys, had watched them burn and believed that superiority was permanent. But war doesn't respect arrogance. In the end, it rewards whoever refuses to stop trying. The Firefly was proof of that, not elegant, not perfect, just stubborn enough to matter. It began as a desperate experiment. It ended as a reminder that sometimes survival itself is victory. Today there's a Firefly standing outside a small town in Normandy. Its tracks are rusted, its barrel points toward the sea. Tourists walk by without knowing what it meant. But at dusk, when the light turns gold and the shadows grow long, the tank almost looks alive again. The metal catches the sun, and for a heartbeat, you can imagine the sound. The engine rumbling to life, the gun elevating, the crew climbing aboard one more time. Then the light fades, and the illusion passes. The war is over. The field is quiet. If you listen carefully, the quiet isn't empty. It's full of everything that was lost and everything that was finally balanced. The Firefly never asked to be remembered. It just did its job. And maybe that's why its story still matters. Because in the end, that's all any soldier ever wanted. To do the job, to protect the man beside him, and to see the next sunrise. When the last Firefly was shut down, the crew turned off the engine, climbed out, and walked away. The gun cooled. The steel sank into stillness. Somewhere, an officer wrote the number on a clipboard and filed it away. Paper over memory, ink over silence. But the story didn't end there. It lingers in the hum of distant machinery, in the way engines start before dawn, in the instinct that tells a man to keep moving no matter what stands ahead. That instinct was the Firefly's gift. Because the truth of war isn't found in victory speeches or monuments. It's found in moments like that, when fear meets invention and ordinary men become part of something that outlasts them. The Firefly was never supposed to exist. And yet, when the world needed it, it appeared. Built from desperation, powered by hope, driven by men who refused to give up. The Germans laughed at their tanks. They don't laugh anymore. The night is quiet again, and somewhere, deep beneath the soil of Europe, the Firefly sleeps, its barrel still pointed at the horizon, waiting for a dawn that has already come.